Welcome back. When we were looking at our last lecture, we were talking about the administration of Andrew Jackson. And we saw this time that there's a classic rivalry between Henry Clay, who was in Congress, and Andrew Jackson, who is now president. This is a traditional and a very classic rivalry that reflects the basic division in America that I've stressed a lot, the division over whether the United States is to be a single nation or a federation of states. And I've stressed that a lot, and I hope you've been following that. And it started out with at the convention. We saw it then evolve into the dispute between Hamilton and the nationalist position versus Jefferson and the states' rights position. And now it's as time has gone by, the replacements have been Henry Clay with the nationalism, the advocate of a strong federal government and the idea that the United States was a single nation, versus Jackson, who is the advocate of a strong states' rights position, strict construction of the Constitution, and the idea that the government, the Constitution, provides for a federation of states in which each state is still sovereign and still in charge of that state, still the sovereign government for the state. And we saw this with regard to Jackson's vetoing of key elements of Clay's American system. If you remember, Jackson had vetoed the Maysville Road, one of the federal government-sponsored internal improvements, which was a key element of Clay's American system. But Jackson vetoed it and said that no, it shouldn't be the federal government that built that road, it should be the state of Kentucky. If anybody is going to build it, it's up to the state, not up to Congress. And he had also then, Jackson had also vetoed Clay's bill to extend the charter of the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States had, since the days of Hamilton and Jefferson, been one of the dividing issues over whether the government should be a strong national government with a national bank, or it should be state banks, and the idea of state sovereignty, limited federal government, strict construction of the Constitution in order to limit the power of the federal government and reserve greater power for each state. And that was Jackson when he vetoed the Second Bank of the United States extension bill. So it's just an updating in the 1830s of a basic debate within the United States that has been going on since the establishment of the national government in 1787 with the Constitution. And here it is. These two men are classic rivals, and Clay is trying to push his American system with a strong federal government to promote economic growth. Jackson favoring state sovereignty, and an implication of that is retaining the classic Jeffersonian ideal of the United States as an agrarian nation. And then we started to talk about the third element of Clay's American system, the tariff. And this is, again, a classic example of the rivalry between these two visions of America. On the one hand, Clay and the American system advocate protective tariffs to protect American industry, to protect national economic growth, and support for industrialization as part of the grand economic plan for the prosperity of the country as a single nation. And opposed to that is the idea that the United States should remain an agrarian nation, not pushing for economic development and industrial growth and all the other things that were so near and dear to Clay and his vision of America. We talked about the tariff of 1816 when Clay was just inaugurating his American system. Just right after the War of 1812, that's when he started introducing his measures. And the tariff of 1816 had been one of the first steps in the achievement of Clay's vision of an American system. And as I told you, that tariff in 1816 had revealed not only a sort of an ideological division within America, but it kind of paralleled a geographic division, where the tariff issue split the country somewhat along sectional lines. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a clear-cut division yet. In 1816, the Northeast was somewhat ambivalent about the tariff. Within the Northeast, there's sort of the new rising class of industrialists who favored economic growth and favored tariffs. But there was still substantial support for the classic mercantile idea, the merchants, who opposed tariffs because they were afraid that tariffs would just cut down on the total volume of trade and hurt their economic prospects. So the Northeast was divided, but as I told you, the West was very strongly pro-tariff, and the South was very strongly anti-tariff, with the particular and peculiar exception of South Carolina. I think I told you, if you did a map of the country and you looked at each of the congressional districts, and then you put the districts where congressmen voted for the tariff in one color, and the districts where the congressmen voted against the tariff in another color, you'd see that the South was all united anti-tariff, except South Carolina. And there, South Carolina stands out as a pro-tariff state in the midst of the southern region. It's not like the rest of the South. And the reason was, I told you, that the leaders of South Carolina in 1816 believed that South Carolina is going to become the great industrial center of America. And they believed that because the leading industry, the cutting edge of industrialization in America, was the textile industry. South Carolina was one of the centers of cotton production. Cotton is becoming the prime raw material for the textile industry, and so it makes sense to have the manufacturing, the factories, close to the source of raw material, so you don't have to transport the raw material long distances just to get them from the field to the factory. So South Carolina figures they've got the advantage. And yes, the industry had gotten started. The industry was getting started in New England, and there were reasons there, but South Carolina said, well, we have all those reasons. We have the industrial base, or the financial base. We have a cheap labor supply. We can get the power with steam engines. We don't need the things that New England is having to dominate the early days of the textile industry. So they were confident of that, and they therefore felt that the tariff would help the South Carolina economy and help it in its path to industrial leadership. All right, so that was 1816. In 1824, Congress passed a revised tariff law that raised tariffs even higher. And in 1828, it passed another tariff law just in the last days of the administration of John Quincy Adams. This raised tariffs even higher. But by 1828, the geographic alignment on the tariff issue had become much more clearly marked and distinctive. By 1828, the Northeast had decided that its future lay in industrialization, and that this would not necessarily be bad for merchants, that there would still be a lot of foreign trade, that we would be carrying, that northern merchants would be carrying southern cotton to factories in England, We'd still be importing a great deal of material from England despite the tariffs. And so the North had sort of resolved into a solid pro-tariff region. The West remained solidly pro-tariff. And the South was strongly anti-tariff. And the whole position of South Carolina had changed. South Carolina, which had been out of sync with the rest of the section in 1816, now had become the leading anti-tariff state in the country. It had switched 100% from 1816 to 1828. What accounts for this change? Why did South Carolina, which had been different from the rest of the South in 1816, now become the strongest anti-tariff state in the country? The answer is that South Carolina had failed to industrialize. In 1816, they thought they were going to become this great industrial center. In 1828, 12 years later, there still was not one textile mill anywhere in South Carolina. The textile industry has continued to grow and expand. More and more factories have been built in New England. The textile production is increasing. Cotton production is increasing. The area of the South that's given over to cotton production is getting larger and larger. But all of the manufacturing is still in the Northeast and none in South Carolina. Why did the dream not come true? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. Remember, I told you that South Carolina had, at least based in Charleston, it had a classic merchant class of successful merchants who've been engaged in trade for many decades, over crossing several generations, and they had accumulated a great deal of capital wealth, classic wealth. Charleston was smaller than Boston, but this kind of a counterpart to it, just the same as Boston, just a little bit smaller, but still with a merchant class with money, capital to invest in textile mills. And that's what they were counting on. But they didn't do it. South Carolina's investors, the investors of the city of Charleston, declined to invest in cotton mills. So there are no cotton mills in South Carolina. Instead, South Carolina's, if you will, investor class, the potential investors, found other ways to invest their money, other ways that offered greater return and greater security, greater certainty of a profitable investment. There were two things that South Carolina's investor class chose to put their money in instead of factories. The first was land in the Southwest, out through Mississippi, Alabama, into Louisiana, and even far into at least eastern Texas. With the great demand for cotton, the demand for land was increasing rapidly. People are moving into that area to open cotton fields. The population is increasing in places like Mississippi and Alabama, western Georgia even. And with that increasing in demand, the price of land is rising dramatically. This is the 1820s. As I've said, the American economy is booming, and that includes the production of cotton in the South, and that means that along with everything else that's booming, the price of land is in booming. And investors in South Carolina, in Georgia, in Charleston, saw that they could invest their money in land in the Southwest, hold it for a period of time, and then sell it as farmers came in, and can make tremendous profits from speculation in land. That was a highly successful, highly profitable business, and that's where Charleston's merchants put their money, not into factories, not into textile mills. So land was a great investment opportunity for the, what you might call the investment class of Charleston, South Carolina. The other source of investment that was highly profitable and much more attractive than investing in textile mills is related to land. And some of you may be anticipating what that is. I hope that you're kind of ahead of me on this, that you can see where this is heading. Farmers growing cotton needed slaves. Cotton is a highly labor-intensive crop to grow. As I told you, I think it required a lot of labor to tend the crops during the growing season. The growing season is very long. That's why cotton is limited to the South. And harvesting has to be done by hand. It's a very laborious process. Fortunately, you can spread it out over a long period of time. It's not like wheat where you have to get that crop in soon, and if you don't, you're going to lose it. So harvesting wheat has to be done on a very strict schedule, and you really have to get the crop in over a short period of time. Because if you don't, the crop will rot and possibly get snowed in. First cold weather will wipe out the crop, so you've got to get that wheat crop in. You've got some leeway with cotton. You can spread the cotton production over, or the cotton harvesting over a long period of time, but that means you have to have people out in the field for a long period of time. And that meant slaves. So the demand for slaves accompanied the demand for land. The demand for slaves was increasing very dramatically. The price of slaves in what we call the Old Southwest, the area from western Georgia across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and into East Texas, the demand for labor there was just increasing dramatically. The price of slaves was increasing spectacularly. At the same time, in parts of the Old South, which is a term that's sometimes used, or what I call the non-cotton South, specifically and especially Virginia, a little bit lesser Maryland, that area is the area of the classic slavery tied to tobacco. Tobacco at one time had been one of the leading crops in America, and it was a very labor-intensive crop, and so there was always a great demand for slaves in tobacco production, and that went back to the earliest days of colonial America. And it was still true that there were cotton plantations, tobacco plantations in coastal areas of Virginia and Maryland. Somewhat North Carolina. North Carolina is sort of on the edge of cotton production, though. But in tobacco areas, yes, there's still tobacco plantations, but the demand is not increasing. Tobacco is not expanding. To the extent that tobacco production was expanding into western portions of Virginia, which it was, to a much greater extent, that activity was being conducted by small farms, not big plantations, small farms that provided the family labor system and didn't require a great deal of slaves, didn't require maybe any slaves at all. So say in Virginia, the demand for slaves is stagnant, it's not growing, maybe even is decreasing as some of the tobacco plantations were were shrinking in size, and land is being sold off for other purposes. The demand for slavery in Virginia, as I said, was flat or even mildly decreasing. And so the price of slaves in Virginia was decreasing. And it didn't take long for entrepreneurs to figure out how to make money off of this situation. You could buy slaves in Virginia at low or decreasing prices, transport them out to, say, Alabama, where the price of slaves was increasing, sell the slaves there at a great increase in price, at a great profit. And the people with the money to invest in that were oftentimes the merchants of South Carolina, the merchants of Charleston, who were taking advantage of this differential in price. Buy low, sell high. That's always the key to success in investing. And so they were investing in that rather than in cotton mills. That's an additional factor that explains why South Carolina failed to industrialize. And it relates to slavery. As I told you, the South Carolinians had expected that they were going to have this great burst of industrial production with slave labor. And that was a key to their whole thinking about why they were going to become the great industrial center. They were going to use slaves as industrial workers. But when confronted with the reality of using slaves in factories, many potential investors said, you know, I don't think we want to go there. The fact is, slave labor probably was inconsistent with industrial use. Slaves, as human beings, found ways to assert their humanity despite their status as property, despite the fact that they could be abused at will by their owners. So slaves developed all kinds of ways to indicate their resistance to their status, ways that had to be very subtle, ways that had to be done very carefully, because as a slave you have no power at all. The master's power is absolute. And if the master chooses to beat you, he has an absolute right to do that, even to beating you to the loss of your life. So you have to be careful. But slaves developed what was known among slave communities, and the word passed from plantation to plantation as slaves interacted. And they referred to what they called putting on old massa. Putting on old massa. It was a way of demonstrating that even though they had no power, they were still human beings and they could still exert some control over their lives. It was a mixed bag of activities that slaves developed. It included such things as just simply appearing to be too stupid to follow instructions and just not doing anything, not working in the field and saying, I don't know what you mean, boss. I don't get it. I don't understand what you want me to do. And of course the image grew that African Americans were of lower intellect, and people who thought that were just too stupid themselves to figure out what was going on. And what was going on was that slaves were putting on old massa. They're gaming him. They're almost taunting him by pretending to be stupid, but that's a way of not letting him have control over them, not being able to exert his complete power over them, because they think, I don't know what the master could get angry and say, why didn't you do that? Well, I didn't know what you meant, boss. or it included breaking machinery, breaking tools, breaking the hoes and the shovels that they were used for their work in the fields. You know, accidentally breaking one. Oh gosh, sorry, broke that hoe. Can't work anymore. And you know, masters could get frustrated about that, and they did. But and for the slave, you have to be careful. You have to you can't push it too far. You can't go too extreme with your resistance, because if you do, the master's going to get the whip out, and then you're in for it. But if you were a shrewd slave, and many slaves were very shrewd, and they knew how to play the master, and just not work, and it's a way of saying, yes, you've got all this power over me, but I'm still a human being, and I can still control my life, at least to some extent. I still have some control over my life, and you can't tell me everything to do. I can do what I want, when I want it, and how I want it, and I'm still a human being. So, you know, it was very frustrating for slaves, for slave owners. I've often thought that if the slave owners had been smart, and they were not, but if they had been, they would have freed their slaves and hired them back as free laborers and just regular laborers, pay them a wage. And then, you know, if a slave goofs off, you have those magic words, you're fired. And if a slave does a good job, you give him a bonus. I mean, you know, that's the way the capitalist system works. And if the slave owners had been smart, they would have played the capitalist system. Slavery was distinctly anti-capitalist. It's not appealing to people's self-interest. It puts slaves into a separate category instead of traditional industrial labor. But it meant that you know, slavery, I think, was, as a labor system, was very inefficient. Didn't work very well, because slaves constantly found out ways to put on old massa. In some cases, they also took more extreme actions. One of the steps that a slave could take that was a little bit more drastic, a little bit more dangerous, took a little bit more courage, was to run away. Just leave. That was dangerous, because if the master caught you and brought you back, he could beat you pretty badly, and so that's the risk you're running if you take something, you do something as drastic as running away. But that happened, and as time goes on, and it's going to happen a little bit more. We're only up until, like, say, 1828, but after that, it became even more and more of a problem for slave owners. Slave owners have this, you know, they're trying to maintain a system that's just contrary to human nature, and it just doesn't work. But slaves were running away, and the level of runaway slaves, this was increasing as time went on. It just increased more and more. As I said, as of the time we're looking at, the late 20s, it was still less of a factor than it became, but it's going to start increasing more and more. And then in the most extreme version of resistance, slaves occasionally would actually revolt, would actually go out and kill their masters, and fight for their freedom. That was very drastic, very extreme. Took tremendous courage, because if it failed, which it always did, you'd be executed. So that's pretty scary to think about a slave revolt. But in fact, that also did happen. The most dramatic and the most extreme version of that was a revolt by a slave, actually in Virginia, in 1831, just a few years after where we were in our chronology. But a slave named Nat Turner led a revolt in which he and his followers killed several dozen of the owners, and were then tracked down and all arrested and executed. But that was a very serious attack on slavery, and it makes it even harder and harder for slave owners. They have to increase their security, they have to increase their attempt to keep control over the slaves because of fear of more revolts such as Nat Turner's. So slavery is a very defensive system. It doesn't work very well. And potential industrialists in Charleston, looking at how they could invest their money, would look at the idea of industrializing, building factories in South Carolina and using slaves for labor there. Do you really want to do that? Do you really want to put a factory with all of the equipment at risk? I mean, it's one thing if a field worker breaks a hoe and then says, "Oh gosh, boss, I broke the hoe, and I didn't know what to do then, so I just sat down for the rest of the day." But it's another if you have a slave working in a factory with a lot of expensive equipment, and oh gosh, accidentally drop the wrench into the gears and damage thousands of dollars worth of equipment. Well, investors in Charleston decided, no, why should I invest in a factory when I can invest in land and slaves out in the West and have a very secure investment? Land values are going up, slave prices are going up. I can invest in that with safety and not run the risks associated with trying to build a textile mill here in South Carolina. So there are no textile mills, and South Carolina has reversed its position on the tariff. Instead of being pro-tariff, they have become avidly anti-tariff. They refer to the tariff of 1828 as the tariff of abominations. And their argument is that the tariff, although the Constitution allows Congress to pass tariffs, their argument is that the tariff was designed for revenue. It's designed to provide revenue for the federal government, and that's why it's in the Constitution. But that the tariff of 1828 had raised such a high level that its real purpose is to protect manufacturing in the North, and by protecting our manufacturing, by protecting the textile industry of the United States, it's discouraging imports of textiles from England. The English textile industry relied heavily on imports of cotton from the American South, but if English manufacturers can't sell their textiles to the American market because of tariffs, there's less of a demand for cotton from the South, so the tariff benefits the North, hurts the South. It hurts the southern agricultural areas that rely on exports to England, but if England can't sell to us, then they're not going to buy from us, and so the demand for our agricultural exports is down, and that's hurting the southern economy. So their argument is that the tariff is not just a source of revenue, it's a source to benefit it's a way to benefit the North and hurt the South. And so they're arguing that it's unconstitutional. It's something that the federal government cannot do. The federal government doesn't have the authority under the Constitution, under the concept of strict construction. It doesn't have the power to benefit one section of the country at the expense of another. That's a misuse of federal power, and it's therefore unconstitutional. The person who made that argument was a name that we've heard, John C. Calhoun, sort of the leading politician of South Carolina. And interestingly enough, the Vice President of the United States. He was the Vice President for John Quincy Adams, who's just outgoing in 1828, and then he became the Vice President for Andrew Jackson, who's coming in as a result of the election of 1828. He will be Jackson's running mate in the election of 1828. It's kind of odd. He's sort of like running against himself, but that's the way things were. The political system was still kind of in flux, and the party alignments hadn't become clear. But he's now, Clay is going to, or Jackson, got it, Calhoun is going to become Jackson's vice president as of starting in 1829. And it was actually Calhoun who drafted a document. He did it anonymously because of his position, but he drafted a document that was adopted by the South Carolina legislature called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. The South Carolina Exposition and Protest, written anonymously, secretly, by Vice President John C. Calhoun, and then adopted by the state legislature of South Carolina. It's analogous to the Kentucky and Virginia resolves of 1798, which were actually written by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson, ironically, at that time, was the vice president. Those two documents were both written anonymously and then adopted by state legislatures. And they both attack federal legislation as unconstitutional. And their key argument is that a state legislature is sovereign. This is the states' rights argument. It's the idea that the United States is a federation of states. The state has a right, a state legislature has a right to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. States have superiority over Congress, over federal legislation. And so the South Carolina Exposition and Protest was Calhoun's analysis of the Constitution, and he concluded that the U.S. Constitution established states and that states were sovereign, and that under his doctrine the tariff of 1828 was unconstitutional. He simply said, as of 1828, we should wait and see what happens, but we are saying that this law is unconstitutional. Over the next few years, the next couple of years during the Jackson administration, starting in 1829, the economy of South Carolina continued not to grow. South Carolina actually was at a time when the rest of the country was experiencing great prosperity and growth. South Carolina was actually going down. Its population was decreasing. Charleston was not a booming city. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, all the northern cities are just expanding rapidly. Charleston was not. The investors in the Charleston are making a lot of money, but they're not making it by local activity. They're making it by investing in land and slaves out in the West. And so the circumstances that led South Carolina to protest the tariff of 1828 became even more extreme. It became more and more apparent that the South Carolina economy was not growing, whereas the economy of New England was. New England, using the cotton that's grown in South Carolina and grown in other southern states, they're booming, but and the agriculture of the West is booming, but the city of Charleston is not showing any prosperity at all. In 1832, Congress passed a new tariff law, the Tariff of 1832. And of course, South Carolina had hoped that it would be lower. It was not. South Carolina's hopes that the tariff would be adjusted, the hope that they expressed in their exposition and protest, did not happen. The tariff of 1832 was not significantly higher than a 28. It's very complex because there are many different products, and there are individual tariffs on each and every product. But overall, tariffs in 1832 were the same or slightly higher than in 1828, but certainly the tariff is still very high, and South Carolina still is suffering, and they still blame the tariff for their problems. They blame the tariff for the fact that The price of cotton is not very high because, at least they claim, that because we don't have our exports to England, because England is not exporting products to us because of the tariff. So they blame the tariff for their problems. And so in late 1832, South Carolina held a special convention to review the issue. John C. Calhoun resigned as vice president. This is 1832, there's been an election that year. Jackson was re-elected, but he had dumped Calhoun as his running mate and hired instead Martin Van Buren. So Calhoun only had a couple of months to go until the new vice president would come in and replace him. So in December of 1832, he resigned and returned to South Carolina to take leadership of the anti-tariff movement in that state. And South Carolina, in early 1833, adopted several state laws that declared the tariff, all the legislation, the tariff of 1832, which is very new. Actually, it's just a series of amendments to the tariff of 1828, but the whole tariff legislation of the country was in a resolution adopted by the legislature of the state of South Carolina. It was unconstitutional. And therefore, South Carolina said the tariff laws were null and void. That means they were not existing in the state of South Carolina. This is called the doctrine of nullification. It's an outgrowth of the argument that Calhoun had made 4 years earlier in his exposition and protest. A state legislature can nullify an act of Congress, declare it invalid in that state. So South Carolina said the tariff law does not exist in South Carolina. They went further. They said that if any of the federal Treasury officials who normally enforce the law, these are just the clerks and agents of the Treasury Department whose job it is to go aboard a ship when it comes into a harbor and assess the tariffs and collect it before the ship is allowed to unload. If any of those federal officials in South Carolina, in any of its ports, if they try to do their job, they will be arrested by state officials and tried and, if convicted, imprisoned under state law for violating state law, the laws of the state of South Carolina, in the state of South Carolina, even though they're enforcing federal law. And as a further step, South Carolina ordered its state militia to mobilize, to be ready, and to take up positions outside of several U.S. Army forts based in South Carolina. I think there were like 3 different Army bases in South Carolina at that time where there were U.S. troops, and the state militia of South Carolina took up positions outside each of those forts and set a notice that if federal armed forces, if the U.S. Army forces based in South Carolina tried to move against the state, that their state militia would resist that with force as necessary. So South Carolina has taken a very strong position of opposition to the tariff, of opposition to federal authority, of the superiority of state law, state actions over the federal government. So now the ball goes to Andrew Jackson, the president. And we know that Jackson is favorable to the whole idea of states' rights. We've seen that in his veto of the Maysville Road and the Bank of the United States renewal. And the tariff, of course, is the brainchild and one of the pets of Henry Clay, who is Jackson's great political rival. In the election of 1832, which has just been held, Clay had become the candidate of the opposition to Jackson. The election of 1832 was Clay versus Jackson. Jackson won. Jackson is a political opponent of Henry Clay, and the tariff is Clay's baby. And we know that Jackson is constitutionally on the same side as South Carolina. He's an advocate of greater states' rights, of limited federal government. He vetoed federal laws that would have expanded the power of the federal government beyond what he thought was constitutionally permissible. So Jackson is on the same side as South Carolina. So people are waiting for him to take action. And there was a very dramatic moment at a banquet at the White House in just as the whole nullification issue has started. The word has just reached Washington of South Carolina's actions. And everybody was watching to see what President Jackson would do. And at this banquet, he got up to stand and to offer a toast. And people who were there at the banquet were expecting him to use that as an occasion to announce his stand on nullification. And Jackson offered a toast with the words, "To the Union, it must and shall be preserved." He is totally opposed to nullification and will not accept it. He took several steps to indicate his resistance to nullification and his refusal to accept it, and in a sense sort of reverse his whole constitutional position. He ordered federal troops stationed in South Carolina to be reinforced. He was going to send additional soldiers down to those bases, accompany them with supplies, daring South Carolina to interfere with this military activity. He sent a message to the people in South Carolina who had opposed nullification. Yes, nullification was very popular in the state of South Carolina. It easily passed the legislature of the state, but there were people in South Carolina who were anti-nullifiers. They were in a minority, but there were Union supporters within South Carolina, and Jackson basically sent out a sort of a public message encouraging them, thanking them for their opposition to nullification, and encouraging them to continue their efforts to try to persuade the state of South Carolina to reverse course and to adopt their position. So he took his side for the opponents of nullification within South Carolina. And he asked Congress to pass what was called the Force Bill, which would authorize him to let the military forces of the United States, the U.S. Army, collect the tariff. Now, the tariff is a law that's enforced by the Treasury Department and its agents who are civilians. I mean, these are, revenue agents working for the Treasury Department. They're civilians. And it's their job to actually implement the terms of the tariff laws. They say, go aboard the ships and collect the tariff and then turn it into the Treasury Department and so forth and so on. But Jackson is asking for permission to use, from Congress, to use the military for that, to use the Army to implement and conduct what is a law for civilians. So he's taking a very strong stand. So we've got, in the early months of 1833, a serious crisis in the history of the country. We have one state with its militia on alert, standing outside U.S. Army bases. We have guns of the South Carolina mission, of the South Carolina militia, pointed at U.S. soldiers in those bases. And we have soldiers in those bases with their guns and their cannons facing the South Carolina militia. And everybody's just waiting around to see if war is going to break out. It would be war of South Carolina versus U.S. Well, as it turned out, as had happened before when the country had faced serious crises, there were people in Congress who said, we've got to find some sort of a compromise here. They were led, ironically, by Henry Clay, who said, yes, I'm pro-tariff, but we've got to find a way to get through this, a compromise. And so after some negotiations in Congress between Southerners who were basically supporting South Carolina and Northerners who were opposed, Congress passed a law in 1833, the Tariff of 1833, which kept the tariff in place, but provided that over the next 10 years it would be gradually reduced down to levels that would be considered for revenue only. Congress basically agreed to repeal the protective features of the tariff laws at that time and simply revert to tariff for protection only, which would pass the constitutional muster of even the anti-tariff people such as Calhoun. I mean, they don't object to a tariff as long as it's not high enough to provide protection. So the country got through this crisis and there was a compromise. But I want to explain to you why Jackson acted contrary to what we would expect. You know, I said everything that we saw about Jackson with his veto of the Maysville Road and the bank bill was indicating that he was on the same side as South Carolina. He's an opponent of Clay and the American system. And yet here he is ready to go to war to protect the tariff. Well, for Jackson, he's really not a classic Jeffersonian Republican anti-federal government. Yeah, he vetoed the Maysville Road. But frankly, that was not because he really was opposed to having federal improvements, federal support of federal improvements. He was all in favor of federal support for internal improvements during his administration. Yeah, we didn't build the Maysville Road, but we built all kinds of other federal projects. The federal government did all kinds of internal improvements, especially in the area of harbor maintenance, of maintaining navigability on the rivers. The federal government built a lot of levees along the Mississippi to make the Mississippi more usable for steamboats, for navigation purposes. And they spent a lot of money on federal internal improvements. He's not opposed to that idea. He's opposed to the Maysville Road because that's in Kentucky. And the congressman from that district is Henry Clay, his political rival. He's opposed to internal improvements that will benefit his opposition, but he's not opposed to the concept. He doesn't really believe in the idea that there should be no federal internal improvements. He just doesn't want to see anything that would benefit Henry Clay, his great political rival. And similarly, his opposition to the bank was not based so much on his view of the Constitution or strict construction. Jackson was not a philosopher. He was not a politician. He was not a constitutional scholar. He did not write his veto messages. He had some lawyers who understood the constitutional. He had them write the veto message for him, because frankly, he didn't understand those constitutions. He's not a constitutional scholar. John Marshall was a constitutional scholar. John C. Calhoun was a constitutional scholar. He understood a lot of constitutional argument and could make all of these arguments in his South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Jackson just knew he didn't like the goddamn Bank of the United States. And he didn't like it because Biddle, who was the president of the bank, was an ally of Clay, who's the rival of Jackson. And Jackson was convinced that the bank was using its substantial resources to support political activities against Jackson and his party. He thought that the bank was engaged in politics, it was a political enemy, and he decided to destroy it because of its political orientation. Jackson's not a constitutional scholar, he's a politician, and he's there to do things that will support his party, the Democratic Party, and oppose Clay. In fact, after he vetoed that bill to extend the bank, as I said, the bank still existed. But Jackson started taking federal resources out of the bank. He started removing from the bank the funds of the federal government. And as I told you, the federal government was the single largest customer of the Bank of the United States, and Jackson took out all the accounts and transferred them to state banks, which were called pet banks because they were banks that were aligned to his political party, whereas he believed that the Bank of the United States was aligned to Clay. So his goal is purely motivation by politics, and these constitutional issues don't concern him. He doesn't understand them, he doesn't care about them. But he knows that nullification is impossible. If South Carolina can nullify a tariff law that it doesn't like, other states can nullify laws that they don't like. And eventually we're going to have all of these states nullifying law after law. The federal government will sort of cease to exist. And Jackson said, that is over the line. You can pass laws, we're going to veto laws that'll limit the power of the federal government, but we cannot allow the destruction of the federal government. We can't allow the destruction of the Union. And so that's a base level. He's willing to play all sorts of games with politics, but not to play a game with the survival of the United States. And so he absolutely resisted nullification, and the Union was preserved. All right. Now, my question for this lecture is, what was the argument presented in the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, written by John C. Calhoun and adopted by the South Carolina legislature in 1828? That'll be your lecture, and we'll pick up with the next topic in our next lecture.